I, it's a really interesting topic. In Around the world, I've actually been asked to give a talk about New England Journal, and principally to sort of prevent the Wizard of Oz from occurring. That is, keeping people in the dark about what we're doing behind the curtain. Um, so when Yvette asked me to talk, I thought this would be a good opportunity, not to talk about New England Journal per se, but I'm going to give you some examples from the journal, but also how you should select a journal for potential publication. And no journal is out of reach. So it's worth thinking about how you might approach this in a systematic fashion, which is often not the case, particularly among young investigators and postdocs who really just want to get published. So they go to the top journal, and regardless of what the journal really is oriented towards. So these are my conflicts. I've been a journal editor at New England Journal for 10 years. So I'm seasoned, but I'm not shielded from tremendous criticism from our authors who don't like our decision. But I empathize with them, and that's why I think it's important to sort of think about what you target for your original research. So I have a couple of caveats. The first is be cautious and don't rush your selection. There is no need to get things in quickly. I know people think, oh, we have to do it because it's a grant and we have to do it. But that speed sometimes causes a lot of consternation because you make mistakes in the submission and often leads to incorrect orientation of where the paper should go. Um, Also, it's really important that you understand the sort of dynamic nature of journal publication. And that is that journals are constantly looking to improve their impact factor. That's the number one, two, and three goals of journal publication is get the highest impact factor. And by doing so, they will often sort of shift their orientation to see what works in terms of impact factors. And so the best example to date is Nature Medicine, which really was a basic journal for many, many years, a really applied science and no clinical medicine. And over the last 2 years, they've made this major switch into clinical medicine. And so undoubtedly, they did it in part because clinical papers often get much greater citations than basic science papers. And so focusing on what those journals are doing now, not versus what somebody said, oh, well, let's just submit it to so and so because that's a good journal, is really important to understand who their target is, and then do you fit that target? And as I said, clinical journals have a greater impact factor. So generally, you'll see the impact factors run between 0 and 90 currently, 90, 95. And the higher impact factor, the better the journal is in terms of how people view it. It doesn't necessarily mean they're better journals, but this is the currency of the publication business. It's all about impact factor. And you'll see some examples of that. So, for example, Reuters, Thomson Clarivat do impact factors every year, and they review the previous year submissions and they look at the number of citations for a given publication. So, a journal that publishes and then divided by the number of uh, times that journal is published. So if you have a journal that publishes just 3 times a year and has high citations, it will have a very high impact factor because the denominator is so low. If you have a journal that publishes every week, for example, Journal of Biological Chemistry is a really great journal. It's a fantastic journal. It's got a long legacy, over 100 years, and it's been a hallmark of scientific publication. But they publish basically a couple times a month, and so they're actually weekly. So they impact factor never really gets above 5, even though the quality of the journal is quite good. So one has to be somewhat careful. The highest impact journal of all times is CA, or Cancer, which is this, if you've seen it, it's a small review article journal that only takes review articles. And so the citations are really high and they're published quarterly. So just just a note of caution that the impact factor has some caveats that are important to understand. And nowadays, in the last 10 years, the impact of predatory journals has been immense. And so one has to be very careful about going to a predatory journal, in part because those journals would like to get more publications. They have online access. So it means if they take your publication, you owe them money, and you must consider whether the money is worth the publication in that particular journal. And it's really important because publication costs now, online access, now running between $5,000 and $6,000 per manuscript. So this has been a real problem for a lot of individuals, particularly young investigators who have a very tight program in their own lab or clinically. Where do you get those resources to pay $5,000 for an open access journal? And that's really the problem, because NIH has said you have to publish open access. You can't put papers into closed journals in which people have to pay a subscription to see the publication. So those are the kind of traps and problems that arise when you begin to think about where and how you're going to publish. So this is just an outline of some of the things I'll talk about. But New England Journal is published weekly. It's now almost all virtual, and this is quite a change from 10 years ago, and even from last year. It's now about 90% online and about 10% paper. And ultimately, it will never recover a paper publication. It'll probably fade out in the next year or two, despite a lot of people who would like to hold on to these New England Journal hard copies. And the reason is it's just too expensive to publish versus putting it online. So New England Journal only publishes 200 original research articles a year. So that, to them, that's one of the focuses. You get the top cream of the crop, and you keep your impact factor at a relatively high level. But for New England Journal, it's not a problem because we get thousands upon thousands of submissions a year. So we're not out there asking people to submit to us, unless I just had a discussion today. There's a new second generation GLP-1 receptor agonist for weight loss. It was press released about 2 weeks ago by the company, dramatic impact on weight. And the phase 2 study, it came off the phase 2 study, but the phase 2 study has not been submitted yet. So we at the journal feel very strongly those kind of papers should be in our space because they've attracted so much attention, and because they probably will be highly cited. So this is the submissions for New England Journal, and you can see that original research is only about a third of what they get. We publish a lot of letters, and review articles are very limited. Images down here, images in New England Journal are pictures of clinical cases, and they are the most widely submitted section of the journal. Thousands and thousands of people send in their images hoping to get published, and it's very, very hard to get in the images. You really have to have a really imaginative picture that nobody else has gotten of a disease or a condition or a disorder. Letters are cited. So when we talk about citations, we talk about original research, which has a citation, as well as review articles. And one thing that people tend to forget is that letters to New England Journal are limited to 450 words, but they're cited in PubMed. So a lot of people say, oh, I got to get published in New England Journal. Well, you can get published with a 450-word letter, as well as with a larger publication. And some of the papers that we see, we recommend rejection, but we ask them to submit it as a letter. And it's just a space. It's all about space occupation. How much space do we have to publish this stuff? So the vast majority of papers are rejected, and we're in the range of 95 to 98% in New England Journal. And some are returned with the decision that it's not acceptable, but if you do this, this, and this, it's possible it will be accepted. So this is in contrast to a lot of journals where the success rate may be closer to 40% or 50%. Triage, which is where you see a paper as an editor and you send it back to the author and say, this doesn't qualify or this isn't appropriate for the journal, is a much more common event where you don't even get peer review, you get an editor's opinion, and that is consistent with not going any further in the publication process, not even being sent out for author for peer review. And that's very common. We do a lot of what we call triage, and this is happening with a lot of journals. It's just too many people are submitting too many papers, so it has to be done. So this is just the impact factor for New England Journal over time. And you can see that in this red at the top was the highest citation publication of the original group of journals that have relatively high impact factor. I'll show you one other thing. Let's see if I can get to the next one. So over time, though, the impact factor changes. And this is an example. In 2021, the impact factor was as high as 168 for Lancet and 158 for New England Journal. That was much higher than the mean values, which have been in the 50s and 60s. And the reason for that is the COVID epidemic. So Lancet got out front very quickly and started publishing papers on COVID in March of 2020. And you can imagine the number of submissions was immense. At one point, we had, I believe, between 50 and 60 papers a day being submitted to New England Journal just around COVID. And so the impact factor for all the journals went up during the COVID epidemic as there were many more publications being accepted. That has now changed, and the impact factor is now in the 90 range. And Lancet and New England Journal are very close. Lancet's 1 and New England Journal is 2. This slide just shows you that what New England Journal, again, it's all about strategy. It's all about, this is the Mass Medical Society that owns New England Journal, but they're very proactive in advertising and being competitive. They want to be the top journal. So they represent data in a lot of different ways. This way is that if the first bar on the left, 85% of the top randomized control trials were published in New England Journal. And so, and that's based on the number of citations. So this currency is citations and impact factor. And these are the things that people use, at least in the upper echelon journals, to really go after the best papers. So these, last year, the top 5 papers were things like this: clinical studies of SGLT2 inhibitors to prevent chronic kidney disease, and in the treatment of chronic kidney disease. Neuromuscular arm prosthesis was a fancy study looking at these new prosthetic devices, and this was semaglutide and heart failure. So these are the top 5 papers and 4 papers of the month, I think in November of 2022, that were cited the most. And not only citations for subsequent papers that they note that they report this, but also just the number of hits that New England Journal gets on its website. So, and the number of non-American publication submissions has gone up considerably, and the number of accepted publications has also gone up uh, uh, from almost none in 10 years ago to about half of the submissions are now outside the United States. So when we get a paper, the authors are encouraged to request who they'd like to review. So they can give the journal a list of people who are experts that they'd like them to review. And they'd also can tell the editors about individuals that are opposed or they think would be opposed to the submission. So when I get a paper like this, about half the time, the people who they recommend reject the paper, and those that are opposed often will feel much better about the paper. So the subjective decision making from the author. So I'm going to submit a paper to the journal, and I'm going to recommend A, B, C, and D to review it, and I'm going to recommend E and F not to review it. Well, we often, as editors, once we get those requests, we'll take one person from each side and put them in as reviewers, as well as getting another person from outside that is not been suggested by the author. And usually we get between 2 and 4 reviewers. And I think this is true for everything, but the ones that we're looking for, and the ones that I think most papers are looking for, is will this change clinical practice? Will this advance our understanding of the biology of a disease? And if it's negative, how it may be a more important study than if it's positive. So we tend to look very closely at these negative studies because they can be extremely illustrative. And so what is informative? It adds to databases. Conclusions are clear. It's free from commercial insights. And a study that breaks new ground or defines new treatments or resolves major controversies, which is often impossible, are things that have never been tried before, are often attractive to the journal. But I would like to point out, and I think this is really important for any of you who are thinking about submitting, that the ethical aspects of this are very important. And so it's really essential that the protocols be approved by the IRB and the ethics committees, that the risks to subjects be minimized, and adequate informed consent be obtained. We don't ask directly for the IFC, but we will in a situation where we're not sure that these individuals haven't been coerced. And this has been an issue sometimes more common in out of the US kind of publications, where one wonders if an individual was sort of subjectively coerced by taking a drug that the investigator suggested would really be effective. And the choice of the control group becomes very important. For example, if we have a study in osteoporosis and the placebo group doesn't get anything, those individuals in the placebo group are at high risk for fracture because they're recruiting high-risk individuals. And so that becomes an ethical issue, and oftentimes that outweighs any of the other scientific aspects. So we then go through a very extensive process of checking the outside reviewer comments, going through consensus among all the editors about whether this could be published, and then trying to send back to the authors the final decision. And we meet once a week on Thursdays for 3 hours, and everybody has a vote in every single paper that we consider for publication. And we try to be unanimous about our decision making. And there are a number of different things. You'll see a paper that you submit to a journal, you might get an outright rejection, or it might say it's not acceptable for publication in its present form, but with this, you might we would reconsider or we would consider it. And sometimes they say it is not acceptable. You'll have to redo the paper as a new submission, which is very, very difficult and oftentimes not successful. So anyways, these lead to a number of different outcomes for authors. And rejection per se from New England Journal is not such a bad thing. It's such a highly competitive process, but we do accept appeals. Although the rate of appeals are less than 5%, we're currently appealing a paper in Nature, but it's highly unlikely this will even be acceptable. In the appeal process, first, the editors have to agree that you can appeal. And then second, you have to submit a response to all the comments, and then you have to get it sent back out. So the possibility of approving the appeals are quite minimal. All right. So what journal should you submit to? It all depends on what your orientation is. Obviously, impact factor can be a determinant, um, but a history of publishing, your work in that area is really important. And particularly if you've published in that journal before, that's really helpful. Obviously, relevance to readers and the topical nature of the issue that you're doing in terms of the journal submission is important. Um, and you want to look at the editorial board and see who's on the editorial board, not necessarily your friends, but if people you know have expertise in the area you're investigating. So with that, I think it gives you a short overview of the publication process and what we do currently at the journal. Again, it's very different for different journals, but this gives you a general idea of what publication's all about, what journals are looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that information. We have time for questions. We have a good amount of time for some questions. Does anyone? I'd start us off with, you hear a lot about replicability, the ability to replicate studies.
Yes,
How do
yes.
you balance that between novel
Yeah,
studies?
so that's a great question. I think it depends on the journal. That's a really excellent question because some of us at the journal are not enthusiastic about a second replication of a previous paper. And in fact, we just had a paper this morning that was on a GLP-1 receptor agonist. And the study was reasonably well done in Asian individuals, but it had already been published in a larger study, not the same uh, cohort, but a larger study had also focused on Asians as part of the huge multi-ethnic population that they were studying. So the journal felt that this really didn't add a lot to what we already know was out there. So I'd say replication is a little bit borderline. On the other hand, if the paper was negative, if, for example, the GLP-1 didn't show an effect in obesity, we would snap that up in a heartbeat because we love negative studies because they provide so much information in a different sort of perspective. So I think replication or non-replication is probably more appealing than replication.
We have a question from the chat. Do you recommend using the website Jane for finding a good target?
Yikes. I haven't used it, so I think anything that might provide the best target might be helpful. I think they do provide information that you would have a hard time finding elsewhere. So I think it's a reasonable tool to use.
And does anyone, what Jane is it a search engine for folks who might not know? I don't,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
okay,
yes.
great. Other questions? I know folks must have some questions out there. For new investigators, how do you decide? Do you just apply to one at a time and wait through the process?
You can
How
only
do you,
apply one at a time. You can
okay,
only apply one at a time. You cannot do it. And there's a waiver or a form that you have to fill out when you submit, which says this is not being submitted elsewhere, and you can't do it simultaneously. So you have to go one by one, and that process can be very, very frustrating and very difficult to navigate. And I mean, ego-wise, it's very hard to get rejections, particularly in multiple journals. And, what I tell my colleagues who complain to me all the time or hold a grudge is that if it gets reviewed, if it gets sent out for review, about 80% of the papers that we see don't even get out for review. But if it gets out for review, that's a high quality paper, even if it gets rejected.
Mm,
So when people write me and say, how could you do this? You're my friend, you know science, this is great. I say, look, it went out for review. And sometimes I'll even say, not only did it go out for review, but we had an extensive discussion at the editorial level on Thursday about your paper. So it isn't as if it's not terrible science. It's just that it's a highly competitive environment.
right. Awesome. Yvette, I saw you came off of mute, and then there's a couple things in the chat, so go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to check in on where you find the impact factor that you can trust, because I assume some of the
Yeah.
journals themselves, can they
Yes.
fudge that a
Yeah,
little bit?
that's a good question. Reuters has their website. You can click on Reuters Clarivate, Clarivate, also has it. But generally, I think you have to be careful of the predatory journals because they will sometimes give you a citation index, not an impact factor, and that's misleading. So that can be much higher, just the number of citations rather than the true impact factor, which is the number of times it's been cited over the number of times the journal publishes articles.
And Ashley has a question. What suggestions do you have to go about picking your reviewers?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is not pick your friends, and because they'll get thrown out. Oftentimes we get somebody in recommended, and we go there and they say, "Oh, by the way, I've worked with this person for 20 years, and is this a conflict of interest?" A lot of people will ask, "Is this a conflict of interest? Should I be doing this? Should I be reviewing it?" So I think you want the people who you think are fair and have some knowledge in the field. I think fairness is the most important. That can be very difficult. And it's hard because science is very competitive. So you want to pick the right reviewers that might actually do the review, but you have to be a little careful. It's interesting that most of the people who say don't get this reviewer, as I said, about half the time they not only like the paper, but they suggest that it be accepted. And so you can't really judge who's fair and who isn't, except from word of mouth. And certainly your own gestalt has some strength to it.
Awesome. I'm watching the time and I'm seeing now the
Okay.
questions are starting to come in the chat. What's the stance when you've submitted, but you want to share your work, but you're waiting or you're going through the submission? What about presenting at a conference? Does
That's a
that,
great question.
yeah.
That's a great question. So in the old days, that was a no-no. You couldn't do that. Nowadays, you can do it. You just have to let the journal know, and they would provide you with their policy, which may be, yes, you can go ahead, or no, we prefer to wait for a decision. But in New England Journal, people will write and say, I'd like a rapid review. I didn't mention this. I'd like a rapid review because in 6 weeks, we have an oral presentation at this meeting. So can you give us a 5-day accept or reject? And because we're going to present it, regardless of what you tell us, is accept or reject, because we've already been accepted for a platform presentation. And the journal does that, 5-day rapid turnaround. And so if you're thinking about you've been accepted for an oral presentation somewhere and you have a paper ready to go, you should ask them for rapid review.
Okay, great. And a related question to that, Connie Van Egan has summarizing the paper and picking a target journal to shop it around or shopping it around to different editors before you go
Yeah,
forward. Is
so
that
that's great. It's a great question and comment, Connie. So absolutely, I always tell people, send me a note, send me the abstract. I'll be happy to tell you whether it's even worth your money to get to go through the journal. And I think that's really important. So there's a lot more interpersonal communication, and that's very helpful. I just had an author a couple weeks ago thank me, said, "I'm so glad I didn't waste my time in New England Journal. Your advice was correct. I went somewhere else, and everything worked out." So that's a great point. I didn't mention it, and that's really important. So thank you, Connie, for bringing that up. Definitely
awesome?
communicate with the editor.
Great, that's good to know. And then Michelle Labat says some journals give the option for double blind versus single blind review. In
Yeah.
what cases would one or the other be
Oh,
advantageous?
that's a great question. So I uh, I I think that at the journal we don't do double blind. We'd like to know who those authors are, because it does enhance the credibility of the paper if you know they've done good work before. So I think single blind is probably the preferred method, and and it depends on where you are in the ladder. If you're a young investigator and you're not well known, then double blind is definitely the way to go. If you're an established investigator, um, that's gonna that's gonna go into the formula for reviewers. So if they trust what you've done in the past, then that's probably a positive. So it's a touch and go situation. It's a great question. But I think in general, we generally do the single blind. But the other thing that's happened is that many journals, not many, but a few journals have asked reviewers to put their name on the review so that the authors know who's done it. Now, that takes a little bit of courage because I had an incident where in a high profile journal, I reviewed an article and it was a colleague of mine, and the paper was eventually accepted, but the first rejection was harsh and because it had some issues. And he encountered me at a meeting and said, "How can you do this to me? You're my friend." It really hurt me tremendously because I was scientifically correct, but maybe not. And I was ethically correct by putting my name on it and saying, "Okay, this is what it is." Uh, but it really hurt me that he judged me in that way, and it caused a lot of consternation and back and forth emails. And I hope we're over it, but I'm not sure.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much. And there'll be another opportunity after our case presentation for more questions if you think of something. And I'm going to invite Ashley now to pull up her slides